Thank you, Georgina. You were much too polite to say that I lost half of the support from Margaret Thatcher through my speech last night. But it was appropriate that the winner was the reason we're here today. I travelled 10,000 miles to be here, and as usual, the last mile was the hardest, so I apologise for arriving late. It was a rather stressful few minutes arriving here. But I'd like to start with a few thank yous. First of all, a thank you for nothing to Uber for ensuring that we started late today. And then to Georgina for arranging the tour, really, all these engagements. It's been wonderfully exciting, and I'm very grateful to her for that, and to Zach and to Damien for corresponding and Zooming and so on before we arrived, and to my dear friend Sue Thompson here in the pink to my right, who is the reason I'm here, who put me forward for this talk, and with whom I help run Britain and the World, and we're very keen to come here in 2028 for our annual conference, so we're very pleased if we can do that, and if you've got any questions or comments, please do address them to us. I wanted to start with basically where I started, which was when I meet my students, I like to ask them, when did you first know about X or Y or Z? Rather depressingly, it usually is when I just ask them, when did you first hear about X or Y or Z? But with this instance, I thought, when did I first hear about Robert Menzies? And this is the reason. This was my first exposure to Bob Menzies because I read as a child, I was about 11, I think, I read Clive James's first volume of his memoirs, Unreliable Memoirs, and that's where my fascination with and love of this country began, with his childhood in Sydney, and volume 2 called Falling Towards England, and the experience of so many Australians in the 1960s. And he said in his memoir, and this is what stuck with me, about his father was killed in the war. Otherwise, the bereaved wives were mainly paid off in rhetoric, most of it emanating from the silver tongue of Robert Gordon Menzies, alias Ming, who went on to become Prime Minister for what seemed like eternity. My mother never failed to vote for him. She had quite a lot of political nous, but Ming's patrician style numbed her judgment. Thus, she went on remaining loyal to the Liberal Party, while the Liberal Party went on ensuring that her pension would never be so lavish as to encourage idleness. And this element of wit ran through the book, which has persisted with my own way of writing and thinking, and it even can be seen in this wonderful painting I wanted to share with you, a portrait of Clive James by Geoffrey Smart, which you can see in Sydney. One of my favourite paintings. The humour even emanates towards those who are painting or depicting him. And back to 1988, or whenever it was when I first read this book, there was no Wikipedia then, and I didn't live in a house with books, so I had no idea who Menzies was or anything else about him. And so this has been something of a very steep and very enjoyable learning curve, getting to know him. And today's very, very unusual as an experience for me, because ordinarily one speaks at a conference where one is expert. Here I'm coming as an outsider, speaking to insiders, many of whom know much more about the subject than I do. So I'm happy to be corrected, not least by my bearded conquistador here in the front row, Dr. Zachary Gorman. So please do give me contributions and suggestions as we go through the talk. My suitcase was impounded at Newcastle Airport because there was so much paper in it. The paper was so dense they couldn't see what was in the suitcase, so they took, and out came all of these Robert Menzies documents and papers and things. Took about coals to Newcastle as I brought them down under a week ago now. So, would I like him? Does that matter? Would I have liked him? I did wonder. I'm going to spend a lot of time with this person a few months ago. Would I like him? And I think my first exposure was that I would. Those are the memoirs of Peter Carrington. Carrington was sent here by Anthony Eden in 1954 as the High Commissioner. And he describes his first meeting with Menzies thus. It was 3 p.m. when I presented to Bob Menzies my official papers from Anthony Eden. He looked at me with a good-natured expression. Will you have a martini? From that moment, I knew we would get on very well, rather better than Peter Carrington did, who staggered out of Parliament House 3 hours later, having had his glass topped up continually. And that's why I feel in a very safe space with him, and why I've chosen the title of the talk that I have, which is really trying to express a sense of, it's a play on words, obviously, about conservative home, Britain being a home, about the Commonwealth, its purposes, and indeed, to some extent, the end of the Commonwealth as he knew it, and which he regretted. And those are themes of the talk, and it will be, I hope not a rambling, but a wide-ranging conversation and discussion about reputation here and there of Australia and of Menzies, and I hope with some threading comments through the papers we're going to be hearing over the next 2 days. Some points of connection, I hope. My other big dilemma was how much cricket to involve, and thank you for Georgina for mentioning last week's test match. I thought maybe, not everybody quite appreciates the beauty of the great game, so I wondered about having any, and then I thought, no, sod it. Bob Bob would have appreciated having as much as possible, not least as he had 3 chapters of his memoirs about cricket. So there is a bit in here, 3 slides at least on it, and session 5 tomorrow with 2 papers I'm looking forward to very much. The relevance of this is quite significant because here's one example of how his interest was used to illustrate wider norms. I'll return to this theme later on. Menzies going out to bat, but for whom is he batting? The Commonwealth or the common market? The thought of Charles de Gaulle playing cricket is rather an entertaining one in itself. And this theme comes across through the talk, which is constructed in these 3 broad categories. Firstly, Menzies in his time, and related concerns, then some thoughts on conservative homes in general terms, and then in our time, which relates to his period, his life after the premiership and indeed his afterlife in our minds. And to set us off, rather a pleasant little poem I found in Punch from '56. He who would bargain with bold Robert Menzies need to have specs with some very strong lenses, for a keen pair of eyes and a strong bush of eyebrow are trained to disguise an Australian highbrow. I rather like that. And it also demonstrated the prominence and the familiarity with which people in Britain felt Bob Menzies at the time. His prominence in the 50s and 60s in the UK, I hadn't quite appreciated quite how fully, and that will come across, I hope, in the talk. Indeed, he described himself as, quote, as proud as Lucifer of his Scottish ancestry. And I was trying to think, with the words Lucifer and Scottish ancestry, whether there's another international statesman the UK government has tried to placate and to attract through applying his Scottish ancestry. And I couldn't quite think of one. And then, of course, the President of the United States, where it was thought that his mother, being from the Outer Hebrides, would be his rosebud, and we could use this to exert influence on this president. Stuart Ward has spoken of Australia's place in the British world, and of course, Menzies is absolutely central to that. His concern is, as you know, the home is never seen. We have his 1935 trip to the UK, which Josh will be speaking about immediately after I finished, and his comments in 1948, before he becomes Prime Minister for the second time. The boundaries of Britain do not lie on the Kentish coast. I'll return to the Kentish coast later in the talk. They are to be found at Cape York and Invercargill. And so a few comments on his sort of peers, his prime ministers. He defends in his first volume of memoirs, Afternoon Light, MacDonald and Baldwin, on whom we have a talk by Alex and Henry later, and Austin Chamberlain. But first of all, I wanted to mention Attlee. This is Menzies and Churchill and Attlee, right in between the elections of 1950-51. So Attlee's lost his majority, effectively, and is about to call another election the following year. And so here's Menzies between 2 prime ministers, on his left, the current, and on his right, the future. And he gets on very well with both of them, and he says nice things about Attlee in his memoirs, his laconic style and his patriotism, but there's a much greater obvious affinity with Churchill. And this comes across very clearly at private conversations and communications with Macmillan about how pleased he was that Macmillan prevails over Gateskill. He is clearly a conservative supporter of Britain's Conservative Party. And his pleasure there can be seen. Also, I think it's significant, this is in London, the Australia Club. To get both of them along, again, is testament to the prominence and the influence that Menzies had. But Churchill is of a huge significance, and indeed the first chapter of Afternoon Light is devoted to Churchill and the relationship. And as a scholar of the period, I mean, people tend to prioritise the role of Churchill in their lives and their role in his. But it's clear in Menzies' case that they were very close and that the relationship was an enduring one, not without tensions. The 1940 moment when Menzies wanted more influence in the British government, to be part of the British government than Churchill was prepared to accept. But nevertheless, very significant. He says actually at the time he attends cabinet during the war, as he does after the war, he's almost a de facto member of the British government, the ease with which he can attend cabinet and speak to prime ministers. And he comments on how many yes men Churchill has around him. And it's ironic in a sense because reputationally, as I've understood, Menzies himself was criticised for being a yes man to Churchill, not least through the British atomic tests. And here's a cartoon from the great David Lowe, the Kiwi cartoonist who came to Britain between the wars, which uses the Petrov scandal as a prompt for referring to the use of Australia for atomic tests during Churchill's final premiership. More significantly is the Prime Ministership of Anthony Eden. And here's Menzies and Eden outside Downing Street as the Suez crisis is about to explode. And Eden describes in his memoirs, quote, "Our friendship had grown through the years and I felt a deep affection." And well might he, you might say, given the importance and the role that Menzies had during the Suez crisis, the greatest catastrophe in British foreign policy of the century, and arguably remains the case, although Iraq runs it a close second. And to some extent, he warns about Suez privately, and then he defends Suez publicly. He is the face for the Dulles Plan, and so here's the notion that British and French, so-called acting independently, really requires the influence of great powers, with Menzies as a mediator. And of course, he fronts up Suez as well. Here he is at Lancaster House, and his ease in obtaining the pulpit of press attention is apparent from this photograph. Menzies and Eden also appeared in conversation. This is at the Dorchester, which is where Menzies always stayed in London. Even during the war, he stayed at the Dorchester. So downstairs, he would pop for this event in conversation with Anthony Eden, chaired here, as you can see, by Attlee. And a rather nice testament to British democracy. Eden had just beaten Attlee the year before in the general election, and Attlee resigns. But good grace and civility obtain immediately thereafter. This gives me a prompt for my first cricket slide. Clem was the most pro-cricket, or the most cricket-obsessed Prime Minister that we had, and had a ticker-tape machine installed in Downing Street to give him the county scores. And that gives me a chance to show this wonderful photograph of Menzies at Lord's in '57. We have Elisa speaking on Lord's tomorrow on the sacred space. You can see the parched grass, which shows we do have sunshine occasionally in England. And this is behind the pavilion. And I just love it because it shows, and Gideon Hay, the great cricket writer, has got an essay about this photograph, that all these ex-Test players, and Menzies is there because he could be, like a child with a train set. He's allowed to have this opportunity and is taking it. And Clem would have been very proud of that. And he says in 1958, quote, "The world would be a better place if the United States and Russia could be persuaded to play cricket." There is actually, during the First World War, lots of commentary about if the Germans played cricket, there'd have been no First World War. We can discuss that later, I suspect. But the most important relationship he has is with Macmillan. And this is a wonderful photograph taken here in Melbourne in '68. And I love it because it just shows the quality of the light in this country. You would never see that level of, that clarity of light in the UK as you do here. Brilliant photograph of both of them out of office, maintaining their friendship. And it's an ironic relationship in a sense because Macmillan oversees two particular policies which are the biggest bones of contention between Menzies and British governments, past or present or indeed future. Andrew was speaking about this tomorrow. In Macmillan's diaries, we see constant references to Menzies appearing, them having dinner together, 5-hour private conversations, and so on. And yet there's a sense of Macmillan playing him throughout. Macmillan is an extremely effective poseur and can present himself as being sentimentally attached to the Commonwealth. Indeed, his tour here was an example of that in '58. He's the first Prime Minister to visit Australia, the first Prime Minister, after all this time, at '58, to arrive. And this lovely cartoon from David Lowe, which I thought about this morning as I was getting dressed and listening to the news of the latest chaotic budget by this rather hapless government. He's down here with Menzies and with Sir Walter Nash, the New Zealand Prime Minister, looking up at the chaos back home of Britain, trying to reconcile itself to a diminished status in an increasingly uncertain world. And this could be reproduced at many points subsequently, but was especially apparent this morning as I was stumbling around in my room. But the two issues which are, of course, of most germane importance are the Winds of Change speech, which Macmillan gives in Cape Town in '61, which is his acceptance of the inevitability of decolonisation and almost the embrace of it. And in so doing, the embrace of countries which do not see themselves as being part of the Commonwealth empire as Australia, New Zealand and Canada, the most important dominions, did. It was not the Commonwealth that Menzies believed in, and this was a bone of contention. But I think Menzies, as Macmillan did, recognised the inevitability of what was taking place. The second, of course, was Europe, and Paul's speaking on this tomorrow. And I think I call it a 1962 moment, that sense when Britain is definitely going in. Nothing can be said to dissuade them. Macmillan, indeed, and there's a few slides I've got now to show you. This is one of my favourites, which is self-explanatory. And this comes up often, this motif comes up quite often in the cartoons about where affections lie and Macmillan cheating on the Commonwealth. Also, a curious predilection of cartoonists in this period to dress up statesmen in sort of cross-dressing. And so here's Menzies in a dress, and rather disturbingly, we have Comrade Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle in bodices in this cartoon, which shows once again the distractions of the common market and stay with your own people is the admonition from Menzies in this cartoon from Norman Mansbridge. Macmillan, of course, of Scottish heritage, as was Menzies. And the last one, which is the importance of Menzies to Britain's application. Macmillan was fearful of Menzies. It was widely felt that Menzies had the ability in him publicly to denounce the policy and thereby to scupper the negotiations. Kit will be speaking about this tomorrow. There's a much wider love for Menzies in the country, which comes across in the popular newspapers, the serious newspapers, and in Parliament, parliamentary debates, and so on. There's an extract here, which I haven't got time to read in full, from Lord Killearn in 1956, saying that, "I confess I am one of those who have often wished it were possible for Mr. Menzies to have a bigger part in domestic politics in this country. He may have had the ability to scupper Macmillan's negotiations, but didn't do so. It was not his way of behaving, not his way of conducting himself. He recognised, I think, realities here as well, and the shift of accepting Britain's shifting priorities was felt before. Macmillan, despite dressing this up in sentimental language, is extremely hard-headed and clear-eyed about how he sees Britain's future." Other examples of the affection for Menzies in Britain include the Telegraph leader about Mr. Menzies grasping the nettle of communism, in particular in this instance about the Brisbane port strikes in 1950. He's cited regularly as the example of how to confront the menace of the East during the Cold War. And there's regularly his attendance at Cabinet throughout this period. And that's one reason why there's so much weight is placed on speaking to and negotiating with Menzies during these EU talks. And there's a rather interesting and balanced comment from Macmillan in his memoirs about Menzies. This is 71. "I'd already known Menzies for a great number of years and came to know him intimately during my time as Prime Minister. I never found him seeking the limelight. However, he always cast a substantial shadow in which it was possible for others to obtain coolness and repose." This is one reason, I think, why Menzies is so effective at what he describes as direct persuasion, the importance of personal diplomacy, which was a theme of one of the chapters in the masterclass that we had yesterday with the Menzies scholars. Some thoughts now on conservative homes as an interesting, as a core of the talk, as it were. And in the masterclass yesterday, there was a very interesting discussion about what Menzies means today in Australia and how little he means to younger people. No surprise there, given appreciation of history, but the use made of him in political discourse and the use made of him by the Liberal Party's opponents in comparing the current Liberal Party to Menzies and what he would have thought and would have done. Something very similar can be seen with Thatcher and Thatcherism. And of course, she's much more recent, and so the memory is fresher, but similarities obtain in our return to Thatcher towards the end of the talk. I had a great interest in Australian politics once Wikipedia did start to exist and I could find things out, and then went to university. And I suppose the long perplexing misnomer I had was why it was called the Liberal Party rather than the Conservative Party, as we had. And I was helped enormously by an article by David, who's speaking today on the subject, about why the term wasn't chosen. Partly through a desire to distance the Australians from the aristocratic associations of conservative as a thing. And indeed, you know, the Eton-educated Macmillan, Eton-educated Eden, Harrow-educated Churchill, there was a very clear sense of this as being the party of the landed gentry aristocracy, minor gentry in Churchill's case. And the desire not to be part of that was quite significant. And so discouraged by that. And also, why call yourself conservative in this new and burgeoning country, which is growing extraordinarily fast, and which Menzies can harness this growth and optimism electorally in a way that I don't know of an equivalent in the democratic world. Thatcher comes close, as it happens, 13 years. So is Menzian liberalism more conservative than liberal? This is a question of which there are much better qualified people in the room than I to pronounce. There is protection and regulatory government, which isn't very conservative. We had this conversation yesterday in the masterclass. There is the breaching of the notion of non-interference, so the banning of political parties, which of course is the referendum on the Communist Party, was not something I was familiar with until I did research for the talk, and it's quite a shock to see this in a democracy, even though it can be explained by the circumstances of the time. And his civic republicanism, which can be seen principally through the education system and the Commonwealth, the great provision, the expansion of education in this country, as indeed in Britain. It interests me very much that the Menzies era from 49 to 66 almost exactly maps onto Britain's conservative ascendancy between 51 and 63. And similar things happen. In Britain, there's the Robbins Report to increase university provision. There are a conservative government which is actually doing very unconservative things, like demolishing buildings. The old refrain, doing more damage than the Luftwaffe ever did by levelling ground in cities and building new and indistinct buildings. The Euston Arch being a classic example of the government demolishing something traditional in the interest of modernity. Railways being cut under beaching to promote motorways. So a curious hybrid identity for Conservatives in the UK as well at this time. And the discussion of progress, in inverted commas, and reaction, of which more in a moment. His identity then is very closely related to Lockean, to Burkean notions of Whigs. He was arguably liberal before he was conservative. And one of the questions we can have is, did the party betray Menzies, or was Menzies' liberalism essentially conservative? There are papers on this subject today. Ethan's giving one in particular, Charles as well, which I'm looking forward to very much to reading. A few comments on these two issues of contention then between Menzies and the British in this period. First the Commonwealth and then Europe. In the Commonwealth, Judith Brett has written of Menzies' sense of the centred unity of the Commonwealth and the sense in which he feels, he's referred to by others and refers to himself as, quote, the senior Commonwealth Prime Minister. He suggested to go to Rhodesia to speak as head of a delegation to Ian Smith. Smith rejects this over UDI in '65. He sees this very much as being at the heart of Australian and indeed global politics. And that partly gives me a chance to discuss his aversion to republicanism in this context. He says, quote, people like me are too deeply royalist at heart to live comfortably in a nest of republics. And of course, he's sufficiently adept to move away from issues such as calling the currency of the royal when there isn't public support for it. He said famously and rather strikingly about the Watergate crisis in 1974, better a monarch above the storm than a president below the gutter. The apolitical identity of the monarchy, and it is a protector of rights, is something he believes very strongly. Never seen more clearly than, I beg your pardon, I'm going out with my slides. This was a cartoon which I should have showed you just before, which shows Britain's economic plight. Again, occurred to me this morning, listening to a response to the budget, which was delivered in inverted commas by the Chancellor yesterday, which has Macmillan stuck between the green pastures of Europe and what to do about economic policy with Britannia and the Dominion Prime Ministers in the back. Who's in charge here? Macmillan knows where he's going, even if it appears in this cartoon that he doesn't. This was what I intended to go to the next slide, which is the famous and very successful tour of Australia by the Queen in '54, a year after her coronation, which of course led to many comments and jokes about the alleged or apparent obsequiousness of the Prime Minister towards her. But his affection for her is very similar to Churchill's. It's very similar to many British statesmen at the time as well. She represented in a curious way, despite being an example, a continuation of heredity, modernity, the new Elizabethans, the jet age, a very common refrain in British popular discourse at the time. But in this period, we have the shift from the Crown Commonwealth to the new Commonwealth. And in particular with South Africa, Menzies objected to the notion of intervention. We believe in autonomy, he said in '67, a year after leaving power. His thoughts on South Africa and on apartheid are perhaps the most awkward to read today. They're of their time, but whereas other things can be sit quite well, and I'll give examples towards the end of the talk. That's one that does seem rather out of its time. He saw three circles. He saw the United Kingdom supporting the US partnership and West European solidarity and the Commonwealth. He is expressing in this Churchill's conception of three circles, concentric circles at which the middle sits Britain, uniquely able to exploit and leverage Commonwealth, Europe and Atlantic in terms of its policy. How to adapt to being a former great power in a newly bipolar world. Europe, even more sensitively. And I knew about the Australian attitudes towards Britain's membership, but I hadn't realised quite the extent to which this was a profound issue here, and it was indeed for Menzies, and the influence he can exert on this. So another example, here's John Diefenbaker, the Canadian Prime Minister, and the effect that Menzies can have on Macmillan's attempt to ascend the mountain of Europe. This is, don't forget, 6 years after Britain has withdrawn from the negotiations over Europe. This is a pattern of failure in foreign policy without precedent. Suez was a one-off example. Europe has been a continuous series of uncertainty and contradiction and failed policies and failed rhetoric. His concern here is that the Commonwealth negotiations mean that Britain is turning its back, common market negotiations, Britain is turning its back on the Commonwealth. And this is really very hard to bear. Howard Wilson uses this repeatedly to mock Macmillan and Douglas Hume in '62 and '63. And indeed, beginning of '64, before he wins the election, about how Menzies is speaking for the public rather than for the government. And Wilson is another Commonwealth man. Sentimentally, Howard Wilson is, despite being a Labour politician, a Commonwealth man who is convinced half-heartedly and on pragmatic grounds about the merits of Europe as an area of policy. And also, fundamentally, he's an opportunist who's using Menzies as a stick with which to beat and to prod Menzies. And so we have unusual bedfellows created in this period. Stanley Franklin in the Mirror has, should we say, a very early example of Russian grey zone activity, where the Communist Party and the Soviet Union and Menzies are both trying to thwart Macmillan's negotiations in Europe. The overall sense that I have in concluding this bit about Europe and about the Commonwealth is that, and indeed him as a conservative, is that whereas his view of the Commonwealth and Europe is very clear, his objection to change in both of them, or his resistance to change in both of them, he very rarely, if ever, uses the word conservative himself or of himself. And yet, tradition, continuity is enormously important. In '62, he's in London again, and he attends a rather infamous exhibition at the Tate called Colonial to Contemporary. And there's a public debate over the nature of the art in this exhibition. And he says, having seen it, quote, "I am a reactionary." But that's the only time I've seen him use such a term. Continuity, endurance, stability, these are the watchwords of any conservative, small or large C. Received values under God against communism, and the Commonwealth representing a means of refuting them. And so its ending and the equal status of many of Commonwealth governments who are less averse to communism and wish to become republics and not be part of this, of the Crown, profoundly unnerve him. The end of an era can be seen in 1965 on a piercingly cold morning in London, what I have to return to very shortly next week, and Churchill's funeral. And this is, as Menzies on the second right, alongside Macmillan. Other end of the line, there's Anthony Eden, seated is Clement Attlee with a stick. The chap leaning over slightly with his hat is Bill Slim, who was Governor General here in the 50s. And these are the pallbearers for Churchill and his funeral. And once again, one can see the prominence that Menzies has in this association. And rather, I discovered this morning, I checked, a year to the day he resigns as Prime Minister. A year to the day, 20th of January 1966. And that's why I shift now into my final section, which is in our time. Menzies in our time. And I think one would have to have a heart of stone not to, given his thoughts about the home he'd never seen when he sees the White Cliffs of Dover in 1935, a heart of stone not to find it rather touching that he becomes governor of the Cinque Ports in 1966. Indeed, he succeeds Churchill in this role. And he's the first foreigner, I say foreigner in inverted commas for obvious reasons, the first foreigner in 1,000 years to have this role. Now, I do realize that this type of, he was increasingly prone to wearing regalia and wearing ornate costumes and so on, which became increasingly ridiculed here, not in Britain. You can see in this photograph the extent of the coverage, the attention that his presence arouses. But this rather complacent sense of the past in him, and yet I detect much more in the way of vitality and wisdom and sagacity than merely resting on laurels. At the MCG in 1977, another very poignant photograph. This is taken during the centenary test, which I'm sure many of you know was obviously a century after the first test, with exactly the same result, Australia winning by 45 runs. And a very poignant photograph, because this is the last year of his life. And for two reasons, I think. One, he's being awarded the Order of Australia by the Queen. So for the first time, the government's introduced Australian honours system rather than simply using the British system. So in a small way, it's a great honour, but it's also demonstrating a shift from, inverted commas, the mother country. So that's the first point. Second is, of course, that he's unable to stand, he had a stroke, and his instinct would be, of course, to stand and to bow to the Queen. So a poignant last image of them together. And indeed, very shortly afterwards, this photograph is used to illustrate the cover of The Australian when he does pass. And I was struck when I saw this about the prominence that the royalty has in the presenting of this. So the Queen is the first person quoted, and indeed the suggestion is that the Prince of Wales, heir to the throne, may come to the funeral, and he does. And in so doing, he demonstrates the importance of Menzies for the family. So my clicker's not quite, my thumb is sticking on my clicker. And so his reign, as it were, in Britain's sense, it comes to an end. There's many newspapers in Britain provide full obituaries, which is very rare in this period for a foreign statesperson. I'm something of a connoisseur of obituaries, and my next publication is about political obituaries, and the way in which the Times, for example, opens its obituary by saying that Menzies was an imperious man in a country averse to such men. and the Telegraph merely described him as a friend of ours. And these are more critical than moment of thought for the period. Obituaries become much more critical over time. They were rather sort of and commoner until the 1960s, and they become more critical subsequently. But Menzies' role is very significant, and the present king comes here on a wet Melbourne morning to represent the Queen. And Menzies, as a good Scot, would no doubt be aware of William McGonagall, the world's worst poet. The great McGonagall couldn't have done any worse than this awful extract from Punch, but I mentioned to demonstrate attitude at the time. Our truest and most honest friend, mourn Britons, for we still could do, with friends as honest and as true. It was a doggerel, but it revealed a sense of, indeed, one could say the moment he announced his resignation, Britain's influence in the world receded still further. A genuine friend, an almost, not uncritical, but a very strongly loyal friend had been lost, and the Commonwealth's senior Prime Minister with it. And so my concern is with this talk, and more generally, is about political reputations, about obituaries, about how legacies stand and continue, about cancellation, indeed, of many. It was very striking in our masterclass yesterday and several other conversations I've had about how some on the left regard Menzies and the terms they would use to describe him, which are very much of our time. And the examples, which I've given, are those which are cited or prayed in to this end. There is, in some sense, a scene of a sense of passing of the waves. Margaret Thatcher comes here 4 times in her life, and she comes in 76 after the Liberals win their victory. She comes to what she describes as a victory conference and visits Menzies in September 76 and writes about this to back home. And she cites this meeting in 1981 where she comes to Monash University and gives what I think is one of the most significant speeches she does offer about Thatcherism, the most clear definition of Thatcherism as an ism, in 1981, which is her lowest point, and which was marked, as today has been, by a seminal budget. And she describes Menzies in her lecture. I should say that when he died, she said that, to me, Sir Robert Menzies is immortal. Those were Margaret Thatcher's public statement on news of his death. And in her lecture in 81, she describes or says, quote, "He encouraged me to talk about my philosophy of life and the principles which should govern public policy. I think, therefore, he would like me to use this lecture to describe those values and the way in which they affect my attitude towards national and international issues. I believe in the essential importance of personal responsibility, in personal free choice, and disagree profoundly with those who seek to replace that personal freedom with the presumed superior wisdom of the state." I think within that remark, one can see some ambiguity in Menzies' own profile and political priorities. Some concluding remarks then, I think, as I come to the end of this talk. There's a nice line in the Times' obituary where he discusses Menzies' Vietnam policy and says that his decision was more controversial, but this too was generally accepted. After 16 years, most things Sir Robert did were generally accepted. A sense of longevity and of public acceptance is very rare in an advanced democracy, and Menzies represents this. And that's why I think the title of his memoirs, The Measure of the Years, is so well chosen. And there are 2 aspects of contemporary politics which I want to relate back to that. The first is Brexit. There's an extract in The Measure of the Years which is remarkably perspicacious on the issue of Britain and Europe. Published in 1970, so written in 69, one assumes, where Britain's going through its 3rd and finally successful application to join the common market. He gives a remarkably, I think, acute paragraph about it may come to pass, it probably will come to pass, but that the British will never fully see themselves in this way. And it's quite possible that the exercise will end in disappointment in a few years' time. And there we have Brexit 50 years before it actually takes place. The ambiguity of Britain in Europe is something that he pointed out in his testament after leaving office. And the second policy area is AUKUS, which we were discussing yesterday in the masterclass. And we don't know, there's no point speculating, but I say this as an aside towards the end of the talk, about how much he may have approved of this as a rejoining, as he may have seen it, of the Anglosphere and Britain and America doing what they did in the war and coming together to fight and face down, as it's not put, but a communist adversary, a communist threat. My penultimate slide and my last cricket reference is to the Prime Minister's 11 that Menzies started in 1951, when the West Indies were here without a warm-up game. And here he is with Lindsay Hassett on his right, Lindsay Hassett on his left, Ray Lindwall on his right, and Frank Worrell, the first black captain of the West Indies, which is a lovely photograph. He loved Lindsay Hassett in particular. And 2 years later, the dashing, debonair Ted Dexter, England captain, and the other chap there you may recognise is the great man himself, the Don, brought out of retirement for one last innings, which I show towards the end of the talk, merely to point out, I discovered yesterday that the England side has declined an invitation to a Prime Minister's 11 match before the Brisbane Test, which I object to profoundly, both in terms of tradition being impugned and in terms of preparation for what will be a heated day-night occasion. My last slide is to frame the concluding comments. And I hadn't seen this before. Yesterday I discovered this, actually. This is the Menzies walk in Canberra. I'm sure Sue's seen this 1,000 times. I'd never seen it before. I find it a profoundly simple and affecting monument to the man and to the city that he in large part created or perfected. And the notion of his resignation being an end of an era is a journalistic cliche, and I use it merely in the fact that this is the concluding remarks of the talk, of how this demonstrates, Britain also, not demonstrates, but is an insight, an illumination of Britain's shifting priorities in the move towards Europe, ambiguous and faltering though that was, and indeed broken as it now has become. His great concern was the impact of decolonisation on the Commonwealth. And the irony, of course, was that it was under him that he retired, just as the Empire did. The Commonwealth Relations Offices closed in '66 and merged into the Foreign Office, only for 2 years. And the contraction, the merging, the melding, as Britain declines as a power, is apparent across this period. And east of Suez, of course, follows very shortly, when Britain is required to retreat in hard power terms as a result of the fragility of the UK economy. Some things haven't changed. I'm struck very much as I conclude, and I have this been my feeling throughout thinking about this and coming here, about the tensions or the way in which sentiment can contest or compete with statecraft. Something for Menzies, much more than for Macmillan, as it happens. Macmillan was much less sentimental about this. And so I'm struck by that in human terms, and I'm also struck, as a person studying this and discussing it with you today, about sentiment and scholarship, something I'll have to wrestle with much more for the published version of this conference. One must preoccupy or predominate with the scholarship. One must privilege that rather than sentiment. But they're very evident, very apparent in the relations between Australia and Britain. And so evident in so much of what I've discussed in my own life and things I've discovered while I've been here. So I look forward to an enormous sense of anticipation for the papers in the next 2 days. And I hope this has served as a mildly satisfying starter for the main course. Thank you very much.